Daniel Carter sat rigidly on the hospital bed, the soft beep of machines around him contrasting sharply with the weight of the words he had just heard. Across from him, the oncologist lowered his clipboard slowly, as if hesitant to look him in the eye. "You have a rare, aggressive form of cancer, stage 4 neuroendocrine carcinoma. I'm afraid you have about 3 months left." Daniel didn't flinch, but inside, something cracked. His mind, usually sharp as a scalpel, went silent. Time didn't stop, but it twisted. 3 months? That was barely 1/4. A single product cycle, a handful of board meetings. The doctor spoke again, gentler now. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carter. It's spreading fast. You may want to get your affairs in order." He nodded mechanically. No emotion, just cold understanding. The empire he had built brick by digital brick suddenly seemed like a glass house in an earthquake. As he stepped outside, sunlight hit him like a lie, bright, warm, indifferent. People rushed by, smiling, scrolling, laughing. The world continued, no pause, no space for him to scream. His car arrived, a black sedan, sleek as his brand. The driver opened the door with a practiced smile. "Sir?" Daniel slid in silently. No response. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Shareholder updates, press interviews, high-priority meetings. He turned it off. The city sped past, but he didn't notice the buildings, the people, the world. He saw his reflection in the window, 30, healthy-looking, powerful. But for the first time, he felt like a shadow of himself. Inside his penthouse, the elevator doors opened to silence. Floors gleamed, windows stretched floor to ceiling, but the luxury mocked him now. Every inch of the place screamed success, yet not a corner whispered comfort. He wandered room to room, a ghost in his own home. No family photos, no shared memories, no warmth, just spotless marble and cold steel. He opened a drawer filled with expensive watches, timepieces worth millions, now all of them useless. Not one could give him back the time he truly wanted. In his study, accolades lined the walls, covers from Time, Forbes, Wired, headlines like AI Titan and The Future Has a Face. But none of it mattered anymore. He sat down at his desk and pulled out a pen. On a yellow sticky note, he wrote just 2 words. For what? He stared at it for a long time. No answers came. That night, he lay in a bed big enough for 2 but always made for 1. The sheets were cool, untouched on the other side. The silence was absolute. Daniel didn't cry. He didn't call anyone. There was no one to call. He simply stared at the ceiling and whispered into the dark, "What have I really done with my life?" And the darkness offered nothing back. The city looked different tonight. The familiar skyline was blurred by fog as Daniel leaned against the car window, hollow-eyed and silent. His driver, Tom, maneuvered cautiously through unfamiliar streets. "Sorry, sir," Tom said, glancing in the rearview mirror. "Road closures downtown. We're taking a detour." Daniel gave no response. He barely noticed. His mind was still trapped in the echo of the doctor's voice. 3 months. Everything around him now seemed trivial. His billion-dollar meetings, the fancy suits, the relentless schedules. What did they mean anymore? The car slowed at a red light on a narrow, dimly lit street. It was the kind of place Daniel's world never touched. He might have looked away, but something out of place caught his eye. Near a rusted dumpster, 5 boys, no older than 10, were huddled together, arms wrapped around each other, trying to keep warm. Their clothes were ragged, their faces smeared with dirt. One of the younger ones clutched a piece of cardboard like a blanket. Daniel sat forward sharply. His throat tightened. They didn't beg or cry. They just sat quietly, shivering, forgotten. Without thinking, he opened the door. "Sir, Daniel, wait!" Tom called out. Daniel ignored him. The bitter night air slapped his face as he crossed the street. The boys looked up, startled. Their eyes were wary, used to strangers walking past without a second glance. But this man was different. He knelt beside them, not flinching at the dirt or the smell. "You hungry?" Daniel asked softly, holding out his hands. The oldest hesitated, eyeing him carefully, then gave a cautious nod. Daniel reached into the bag he carried and pulled out wrapped sandwiches, fruit, and bottled water. The boys stared, unsure if this was real. "It's okay," Daniel assured. "It's yours." Slowly, the oldest boy took one and handed it to the younger ones first. The others followed, each bite devoured like they hadn't eaten in days. "I'm Daniel," he said after a moment. The boy with the sharp eyes replied, "I'm Eli." "That's Mason, Noah, Luke, and Jack." Daniel nodded. They didn't talk much. They didn't have to. The silence said everything. He sat with them, just watching. For the first time in years, he felt present. These kids weren't part of a plan or a project. They were just human, real. Eventually, Tom called from across the street, urging him to return. Daniel stood slowly, his heart heavy. He glanced back at the boys. Something about them had pierced him. "Stay safe," he murmured, voice low. As the car pulled away, Daniel didn't look back, but he knew something inside him had changed. The morning sunlight streamed through the towering windows of the Carter Technologies boardroom, casting long shadows on the polished floors. The hum of conversation faded as Daniel Carter, CEO and tech mogul, walked in. His footsteps were deliberate, his face a mask of focus, but his mind was elsewhere. The usual flurry of activity came to an abrupt halt as Daniel took his seat at the head of the table. He scanned the room of top-tier executives, their faces tense and expectant. The familiar anxiety of presenting corporate updates hung in the air. But today, Daniel had something entirely different in mind. "I need to make an announcement," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet murmur. His eyes swept over the group, measuring their reactions. "I've decided to adopt 5 homeless boys." The response was instantaneous, a burst of awkward laughter filling the room. One executive shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while another, eyes wide with disbelief, chuckled nervously. "Wait, what?" The COO leaned forward, his voice tinged with confusion. "You're adopting homeless kids?" Daniel nodded, unfazed by the reactions. "Yes, last night I met 5 boys living on the streets, and I've decided to bring them into my life." The laughter persisted, uneasy and mocking. One of the senior board members leaned back in his chair, clearly skeptical. "Is this some kind of stunt, Daniel? A temporary emotional reaction?" "You'll be dead in 3 months," another board member muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, but his smile remained calm. "Exactly why I must live now, not wait." He let the words sink in, the weight of his declaration hanging over the room. His voice softened. "In 3 months, I'll be gone. But I won't leave this world without making a difference." The laughter died down, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. The executives exchanged glances, trying to process the unexpected turn of events. This wasn't the ambitious CEO they were used to, the relentless businessman who focused only on profit margins, expansion, and market dominance. Daniel wasn't talking about mergers or acquisitions. He wasn't talking about the next tech breakthrough. He was talking about family, about something real. "I'm serious," Daniel continued, his tone resolute. "These boys need a chance, and He paused, his gaze sweeping over the room again. "I need to give them one." The board members shifted in their seats, unsure how to respond. The room was thick with disbelief, and for the first time in years, Daniel realized that this wasn't about them. It was about him, about the choice to face his mortality with meaning, with connection. No one spoke. No one knew what to say. But Daniel did. He smiled again, this time a little softer. "Now let's move on to the agenda," he said, as though nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The adoption process was harder than Daniel had ever imagined. He had thought that with his wealth and influence he could easily navigate the bureaucratic maze, but he was quickly proved wrong. Social services were skeptical of his intentions. A dying billionaire wanting to adopt 5 homeless boys. It didn't add up. Every piece of paperwork felt like a battle, and each question raised doubts. Why would someone like Daniel Carter, a man who had built an empire from the ground up, want to take in 5 ragged street children? He was wealthy, but he was also terminally ill. It didn't make sense to the people reviewing his application. The questions came fast and harsh. Do you really think you're fit to raise them? You have no experience with children. And you're dying, one social worker said, looking at Daniel with an air of disbelief. Another raised an eyebrow. What is it that you're trying to prove here? But Daniel, though weakened by his condition, was unwavering. He refused to use his wealth to bribe or pressure anyone. He could have made this process go faster with a single phone call, but that wasn't why he was doing this. He wasn't interested in cutting corners. What mattered was giving these boys a chance, no matter how difficult it was. Each trip to the adoption office felt like an emotional marathon. Daniel met with caseworkers, filled out countless forms and answered invasive questions, all while dealing with his own failing health. His body ached, but his determination kept him moving forward. Through it all, Daniel spent time with the boys. He learned their names, Eli, Mason, Noah, Luke, and Jack, and listened to their stories that tore at his heart. Eli had witnessed his mother's overdose, Mason had run away from an abusive foster home, Noah had been abandoned by his parents at the age of 3, Luke had been neglected by a drug-addicted father, and Jack. Jack had been raised in a violent neighborhood where survival was the only thing that mattered. They were broken, all of them. But the more Daniel learned, the more his heart ached for them. These boys had never known love or safety, and here he was, an unlikely figure, wanting to give them both. His wealth meant nothing in those moments. What mattered was the chance to change their futures, to be something they had never had, a father. But the road was long. The system fought him every step of the way, and Daniel found himself growing weary. Yet each time he felt like giving up, he thought of those boys, their faces, their pain, and found the strength to keep fighting. The first few days with the boys were filled with awkward silences and cautious glances. Daniel, for all his success in business, was a stranger to this kind of intimacy. Parenting wasn't something he had ever prepared for. Yet despite their wariness, a quiet bond began to form between them. One evening, after a long day of legal battles and paperwork, Daniel decided to cook dinner for his new family. He had never cooked before. He wasn't sure what he was doing, but he was determined to try. The smell of burning chicken filled the kitchen, a sign of his failure, but there was something undeniably human about the mess. The boys watched him from the doorway, a mixture of disbelief and amusement in their eyes. "Dinner's ready," Daniel called, trying to sound confident. The boys hesitated, exchanging glances, unsure whether to believe him. But when they finally sat down at the table, they hesitated no more. You didn't burn it all, right?" Eli asked, his voice soft but teasing. Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. "Maybe half of it," he said, smiling for the first time in years. The laughter was short, but it felt like the beginning of something important. Despite the mishap in the kitchen, the dinner was the first time in a long while that Daniel had shared a genuine moment with another person. As they ate together, the tension in the air began to loosen. The boys had been through so much, and while they didn't trust easily, there was something about Daniel's willingness to try that made them feel just a little safer. Over the next few days, Daniel began incorporating simple routines into their lives. Bedtime stories replaced the silence that once filled the house. Each night, he read from his old childhood books, his voice crackling with emotion. He didn't know if they understood the stories, but it was the act of showing up, of being present, that mattered most. They played soccer in the yard, laughing as the ball bounced off the fence and rolled away. At first, the boys were skeptical, not used to playing in such a carefree manner. But slowly, Daniel saw them relax, even smile. The physical distance between them began to shrink, their trust growing with each shared moment. Every morning, Daniel made warm breakfasts. He wasn't a great cook, but the boys didn't care. What mattered was that he was there, making the effort. And in return, they began to open up. Mason talked about his dreams of becoming an artist, Noah shared his love of reading, and Luke, though quiet, began to show more of his personality. Even Jack, the most protective, began to soften, letting Daniel in little by little. As the days passed, Daniel's health deteriorated, but it didn't matter. The pain in his body was nothing compared to the warmth he felt in his heart. For the first time in years, he felt more alive than ever. These boys, these broken boys, had become his family, and in them he found a purpose he hadn't known he was missing. As the days passed, Daniel's health grew increasingly fragile. The constant reminder of his ticking clock fueled his desire to make a lasting impact. He could no longer devote himself solely to expanding his tech empire. The work he had once dedicated his life to now seemed insignificant in the face of the greater calling he had discovered. The future of these boys and the future of children like them depended on him. One night, after a difficult meeting with his doctors, Daniel sat at his desk, staring at his reflection in the window. The dim light of the city outside illuminated his face, but he no longer saw the ambitious billionaire that had once dominated boardrooms. He saw a man who had been given a second chance at life, not to build more wealth, but to build something that mattered. Daniel made a decision. He restructured his entire company, diverting billions of dollars into a new initiative, a foundation dedicated to orphaned and homeless children. No longer would his wealth be used to fuel his own legacy. Instead, it would become a tool for healing, a way to offer children a chance at life that he never had. He poured his heart and soul into the foundation, carefully crafting a plan that would reach across the country. Scholarships would be created to give children like Eli, Mason, Noah, Luke, and Jack an opportunity for education they could only dream of. Safe homes would be built in every state, providing not just shelter, but a sense of belonging. Therapy centers would be established to help children overcome the trauma they had experienced, to give them the emotional tools they needed to rebuild their futures. Each initiative came from a place of deep personal understanding. Daniel had come to realize that wealth could buy comfort, but it couldn't buy healing. It couldn't buy the peace that these children needed. His foundation would not just be about giving away money, it would be about giving away the chance to heal, to find hope, to rebuild. At first, his executives were baffled. "This isn't our core business," one of them said, uncertain how to react. But Daniel's mind was made up. He no longer cared about maintaining control over his empire in the way he once did. This was bigger than his company. It was bigger than his entire life. This was about making a difference in the world, something his wealth could never have done on its own. He pushed forward, hiring experts in child welfare, partnering with social services, and creating a network of mentors and volunteers. He poured resources into building homes that felt like more than just shelters. They were sanctuaries where children could heal and grow. Each new home, each scholarship funded, felt like a small victory, but they were victories nonetheless. Daniel's health continued to decline, but he never slowed down. He spent hours in meetings, talking to board members, approving new projects and brainstorming with staff. His body grew weaker, but his mind was as sharp as ever. For the first time in years, he felt fulfilled, knowing that his work was no longer just about profits. It was about leaving something that would change lives. By the time the foundation's first home opened, Daniel was too sick to attend the ribbon-cutting ceremony. But he didn't need to be there. He had already planted the seed. What mattered now was that the work would continue, that the foundation would grow long after he was gone. He wanted to leave something far more meaningful than money. He wanted to leave hope. As the days passed, Daniel's decision to restructure his empire into a foundation gained momentum. The news of his adoption of 5 homeless boys, his transformation from a tech mogul to a philanthropist, spread like wildfire across the media. Headlines screamed about his redemption arc. Some called it a desperate attempt to leave behind a legacy. Others dismissed it as a PR stunt, a last-ditch effort to be remembered for something other than his wealth and business achievements. But no matter how the media framed it, one thing was clear. The story had struck a chord with the public. People couldn't stop talking about Daniel Carter. On social media, posts flooded in, some praising him for his change of heart, others accusing him of using the boys as props in a grand emotional spectacle. A divide formed, and the world seemed split down the middle. Those who believed in Daniel's sincerity flooded social media with messages of gratitude. They saw his actions as a beacon of hope, a sign that even the most powerful people in the world could change and make a difference. They celebrated the fact that a billionaire, with all his wealth and power, could choose to turn away from self-interest and focus on something much greater. Some shared their own stories of overcoming hardship, inspired by Daniel's willingness to give so much to those who had nothing. But not everyone was so moved. Skeptics weighed in with harsh critiques. "It's too late for him to redeem himself," one user wrote. "He's just trying to make himself feel good before he dies." They accused Daniel of using the boys to distract from his inevitable death and the legacy he would leave behind. They argued that no amount of philanthropy could undo years of corporate greed and self-serving ambition. "He's just a man trying to wash away his sins with money," another commenter posted, pointing out the timing of his sudden change of heart. In the midst of the storm of opinions, something unexpected began to happen. The focus shifted from Daniel's personal motivations to the cause he was supporting. Orphanages and homeless shelters began receiving unprecedented visits. Donations flooded in, not just in money, but in goods, services, and time. Volunteers rallied to help, offering their expertise and hands to aid the children. The media began to highlight stories of families who had opened their homes to adopt, inspired by Daniel's bold step. Across the nation, orphanages reported higher visitation rates than ever before. Adoptions rose. For the first time in years, the plight of orphaned and homeless children was getting the attention it deserved. News outlets began running special features on foster care and adoption, highlighting the desperate need for loving homes. The attention Daniel's actions had brought to the issue gave many children a better chance at life. But more importantly, Daniel's story began to inspire a movement. More people started asking themselves the same question: what can I do to help? The ripple effect of his decision extended beyond his wealth and his name. It began to transform the way people saw the most vulnerable members of society. Daniel's personal journey had touched the collective conscience, reminding the world that the forgotten children could no longer be ignored. Despite the critics and skeptics, Daniel's legacy was being written in real time, and it was no longer about just him. It was about the countless children who had been left behind for far too long. His story sparked a national conversation about compassion, about the power of change, and about what it really meant to leave a legacy. And the world was beginning to listen. Daniel quickly learned that the 5 boys, each from a broken past, were far more than just survivors. They were his greatest teachers. Eli, the eldest at 10, had a fierce curiosity about the world. He would ask questions about everything, about AI, about the stars, about why people did the things they did. Daniel found his intellect refreshing, and it reminded him of the curiosity he'd once had before becoming consumed by the corporate grind. Eli's thirst for knowledge inspired Daniel to reconsider the future of his foundation and how it could contribute to the education of children like him. Mason, the second eldest, was filled with an unyielding bravery. He had seen things no child should ever have to witness, and yet he carried on, never letting fear rule him. Mason taught Daniel what true strength meant: strength in facing your fears, strength in standing up for others, and strength in the most unlikely places. Daniel was in awe of Mason's resilience and adopted many of his attitudes in his work, refusing to back down when his foundation faced resistance from bureaucratic systems. Noah, a quiet and gentle 8-year-old, had an uncanny way of making others feel at ease. He never spoke much, but his warm smile and comforting presence were all that anyone needed. With Noah, Daniel learned that sometimes the most profound connections came without words. It was Noah who, one evening, simply sat beside Daniel on the couch, offering his presence as a silent form of love. That moment, small as it was, taught Daniel that love didn't always have to be grand or loud. Sometimes it was simply the act of being there. Luke, the 7-year-old with a mischievous glint in his eyes, had a knack for humor. He could make the others laugh, even in the darkest moments, and his laughter became a source of healing. Daniel couldn't help but join in, forgetting his pain for a while as he watched Luke perform his quirky little routines. Luke showed him that even in the face of adversity, laughter could be the best medicine, and that life didn't have to be so serious all the time. Laughter brought the family closer together, and it reminded Daniel that joy was an essential part of life. Jack, the youngest at 5, was fiercely protective of his brothers. He had an instinct to shield them from harm, always watching out for their safety, no matter how small or big the threat. Daniel recognized the deep love Jack had for his siblings, and it reminded him of the importance of family. Through Jack, Daniel saw that even the most fragile of children could hold the world together in ways adults never understood. Jack's fierce loyalty became an anchor for the entire family, and his protectiveness inspired Daniel to work even harder to give these boys a future worth fighting for. One sunny afternoon, as the boys kicked around a soccer ball in the yard, Daniel felt the familiar weight in his chest, but this time it was different. It wasn't just the heaviness of his emotions, it was a physical pain that seized his body. His vision blurred momentarily, and his breath came in sharp gasps. He dropped to his knees on the grass, unable to catch his breath. The boys rushed to his side, panic flooding their faces as they cried out for help. Daniel managed to reassure them, his voice strained. "I'm okay, just tired," he whispered. But deep down, he knew this wasn't just exhaustion. He was running out of time. As the boys helped him to his feet, Daniel made a mental note that he needed to call his doctor. The cancer was advancing much faster than expected. He had hoped to have more time, to watch the boys grow, to see his foundation flourish, but that dream was slipping away from him like sand through his fingers. In the hospital, the doctor confirmed his fears. The cancer had spread rapidly. There were no more treatments left to try. The doctor's face, usually calm and reassuring, now wore a look of sympathy. "You have weeks, maybe a month," the doctor said, though Daniel knew he didn't need the words to understand the grim reality. Sitting in that sterile hospital room, surrounded by beeping machines, Daniel felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness. His empire, his billions, and all the plans he had made for the future now felt insignificant. It was the first time in his life that he truly understood the meaning of mortality, how quickly everything could fade away. Yet as he lay there, weak and vulnerable, one thing was clear: he was no longer afraid of dying. His fear had already been replaced by something more powerful, his love for the boys. Daniel's body was failing him, each breath more labored than the last, but his heart was still full. As he drifted in and out of consciousness, his only wish was to see the sunrise one final time, surrounded by the boys who had become his reason to live. His voice was weak, but when he asked the nurse, she understood immediately. It wasn't just a request, it was his last desire, and she couldn't deny him that. The nurse wheeled him up to the hospital rooftop, the chill of early morning air brushing against his skin. Wrapped in a thick, warm blanket, Daniel could barely hold his eyes open, but he wanted to witness the light breaking through the horizon. The boys, Eli, Mason, Noah, Luke, and Jack, gathered around him, huddled close for warmth, each of them silent but understanding the gravity of the moment. They had never seen their father this fragile, yet they knew, deep down, that this was his final gift to them. As the first rays of sunlight crept over the skyline, Daniel's chest rose slowly with each shallow breath. He turned his tired eyes to the boys, who looked at him with wide, tearful eyes. "I love you," he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. "Be good men, better than me." For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. The wind stilled, the sun rose higher, and time held its breath. Daniel looked at each of them, a quiet smile tugging at his lips. He could feel the warmth of the sun now, as well as the warmth of his boys beside him. Despite the pain, despite the inevitable, he was at peace. His legacy would live on in them, and that was all he needed. Daniel's passing was peaceful, the kind of end that many hoped for but few truly achieved. Surrounded by the love of the 5 boys he had adopted and raised, he slipped quietly from this world, leaving behind a legacy far more meaningful than wealth or fame. The world mourned the loss of the tech billionaire, but those closest to him knew that his true legacy lay in the lives he had touched in his final months. His funeral was broadcast across the world. Millions tuned in, drawn by the story of the dying billionaire who had adopted 5 homeless children in a desperate attempt to leave something behind. The media, ever eager for a sensational story, reported on the size of his estate, the vastness of his empire, and the work he had done to rewire his company into a foundation. But amidst all the grand headlines, what truly captured the hearts of the public was what stood in front of them at the service. 5 small boys, no longer the emaciated street children they once were, stood tall and proud in black suits. They had grown over the past few months, not just in height, but in strength, courage, and understanding. As they stood by Daniel's casket, the room fell silent. These were not just orphans, these were the boys he had chosen to love, to give hope, to transform. When it was their turn to speak, they didn't talk about the money, the mansion, or the foundation. Instead, they spoke about love, about how Daniel had seen them when no one else had, how he had given them a chance to be more than the sum of their pasts. Eli, Mason, Noah, Luke, and Jack each shared their stories of abuse and neglect that they had endured before they found Daniel, and how he had chosen them despite his own impending death. They spoke of a man who hadn't just given them a home, but had given them the most precious thing of all, his time, his love, and his belief in their potential. Years passed, but the memory of Daniel Carter remained alive in the hearts of those who had witnessed his transformation and the incredible bond he'd shared with the 5 boys. Eli, Mason, Noah, Luke, and Jack had grown into young men, each carrying the lessons Daniel had imparted on them. They stood at the helm of the Carter Foundation, leading with compassion and unwavering dedication. No longer the broken children they once were, they had become leaders in their own right, guiding programs for orphaned and homeless children across the country, just as Daniel had once envisioned. Their faces were no longer marked by sorrow, but by a quiet strength and determination. They spoke about Daniel in every interview, not as the man who had left them wealth, but as the man who had given them everything: love, guidance, and the belief that they could change the world. The money he left behind was just a tool, but the real inheritance was the legacy of kindness, sacrifice, and the healing power of a father's love. The boys had grown, but the lessons Daniel had taught them lived on, shaping not just their lives but the future of countless children who had nowhere else to turn.